All right, so we're going to get started. Heber will join us shortly. So want to first say welcome family to the, and if panelists just do me a favor and make sure you on mute when you're not talking so the listeners can hear. Want to welcome the family to this conversation that LBS wanted to pull together. It's a conversation about what it really means to build Black power, and particularly to focus on infrastructure development. My name is Davon Love. I'm the Director of Public Policy at Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle, grassroots political think tank here in Baltimore City. And so what I want to do is I want to introduce why LBS decided it was important to pull together this conversation, and then we're going to jump into some really important and really insightful and powerful panelists that we had to really advance the conversation forward. So let me just first start by talking about just the context for this conversation. LBS is an organization that's about advancing the public policy interests of Black people. One of the issues that we've advocated on for many years has to do with police accountability. And one of the things that is important to note is that that's a conversation that has been happening for a while, right? The issue of police brutality is something that's been an issue in our community for a while. In the midst of this new defund movement, right, there's been conversations that have been happening for a long time, but have kind of hit the public mainstream about how bloated public safety police budgets are around the United States. Baltimore City is actually a great example of this, where a couple of years ago, Baltimore broke $500 million, right, which is about a third of the city's overall budget in terms of policing. And so that's a conversation that's been happening for a while. It's a conversation that's hit the mainstream, particularly in the context of this notion of the defund movement. And so one of the things that, LBS within just our conversations, we started to observe that there was a missing element to the conversation about defunding police and funding alternatives that we thought was crucially important. Want to shout out to Brother Marvin McKinstry. On Tuesday, we actually had a conversation with a group of folks about the policy side of advocating for police reform, right? Some of the policy considerations that are going to be necessary around police accountability. But the other part to defund that's really important to note is that what are you reallocating to, right? What are the containers, right, that resources are going into? And that's a very crucial part of the conversation when we're talking about defund police. And so that's why this conversation about infrastructure is so important. And one of the things that we kind of observed was that it was kind of in the public conversations. And I'm a person who, as a consequence of the work that I do as kind of a political organizer and advocate, I have to pay attention to a lot of the conversations that are happening on this topic. And it's, to my knowledge, I haven't seen really substantive conversations about the importance of building alternative infrastructure as an essential part of this defund police movement. And so instead of complaining about it, we decided we just gonna pull something together that could really help guide people to that aspect of the conversation. So with that in mind, what I wanna do first is I'm gonna give just some brief historical context as to really to ground the conversation and to really kind of elucidate some of the underpinnings of how institutional building has been a part of Black social movements and the Black freedom struggle. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to invite our panelists to first kind of introduce themselves and their work, and then react to just this general context that I'm going to give in a few moments. And just to note that if you have questions, those are questions that we're going to get to towards the end. So after this introduction, panelists are going to speak to the intro. I'm going to ask a few questions, and then we're going to spend a lot of time taking questions from the audience. All right. So just in terms of some general context, so for me, one of the best examples of the way that the notion of infrastructure development, the issue is marginalized, is when you look at the examples of things like the Montgomery Bus Boycott. It's actually one of my favorite examples. So most of the narratives that we hear about the Montgomery Bus Boycott is Rosa Parks is on the bus. They want her to get off, give her seat up to a white man. She wouldn't get off. It sparked this movement. What doesn't get talked about is the organizing work that was put behind the actual boycott. See, it's important to know that the boycott lasted 13 months, right? So you're talking about a group of folks that were able to develop an alternative transportation system for 13 months, right? As a person who's worked in city government, I know city government agencies that wouldn't be able to do that, right? And so we need to study like what was the level of expertise that, the predominantly Black women, right, that built that infrastructure that allowed them to have that alternative transportation infrastructure that led to the outcome of the desegregation of public transportation in Montgomery. The other historical context is a lot of times Ella Baker is heralded as somebody who, around the country, people talk about organizing as the golden standard. And one of the things that I think is really important as we discuss, thinking about community organizing, but also thinking about it in the context of building Black power, I actually want to read something, an excerpt from this book. It's a book written by Jessica Gordon-Nemhard, Collective Courage. If you don't have it, I highly recommend it. And what she talks about is one of the things that she talks about here is that in the 1930s, Ella Baker was once the chair of the Youth Negro Cooperatives League, right? She was a chair in the 1930s. And so they played a big role in thinking about economic self-sufficiency. So I just want to read actually an excerpt, from the book that I think is really important in the connection between community organizing and institution building. So Nemhard says, this is page 125 of Collective Courage. Baker's Youth Negro Cooperatives League papers gives us great insight into Baker's communication with the League membership and her thinking on cooperative economics, Black co-op development, and fundraising issues. They also gave us a glimpse into her development as a leader, organizer, and thinker. Ella Jo Baker certainly cut her teeth with the Youth Negro Cooperatives League, and she continued her involvement in cooperatives most of the rest of her life, though much more quietly. Most impressive is how her leadership and experience with the Youth Negro Cooperatives League helped to develop her unique style of community organizing and leadership development. So again, when we think about the importance of institution building and infrastructure development, it's important that that's a central part of the history that we lift up as we talk about what that means. And I think one of the things that we see in the public mainstream are white progressives in many contexts that fetishize the spectacle of Black death and suffering, right? And so the part that they see is the importance of kind of elevating images and conversations about Black people suffering. But what doesn't get put in the discourse are the systems that need to be developed, that Black folks own, control, and operate to counter the systems that are doing harm to Black people. That's the part that often gets that to my estimation, often gets marginalized. And so again, I think this is all important in talking about the defund movement. So what I want to do now, just having given that context, I want to go to our panelists to, again, get them to introduce themselves, who they are, their work, and then just kind of respond to that opening context. What I'll do is I will start with Brother Changa.
Peace, everybody. I am glad that you started with that context, Davon, because in my work as conflict resolution and organizational development and just general peacemaker and facilitator of things, especially difficult conversations, what we find is that it's context that we're missing most often. And in context of this defund piece, just to flip the coin a little bit about what you were talking about the infrastructure that was around the civil rights movement in general. Think about this. The most effective weapon that was used in the civil rights era, other than word of mouth, which is incredibly effective, was the television, which was a new innovation at the time, relatively new. And certainly as mass communication in general was new. And it was the images of the atrocities that people hadn't seen that before. And so a lot of the things that we're trying to use and do now, marches and what have you, these videos and what have you, like we're really surprised that they're not having the effect that they did in 1960, right? But we have to take in context, which is we see this every day now. So the media has been flooded with plenty of these images, plenty of it. So the screen is just never going to be the effective weapon that it was, just because of the space of development that it's in. And so that makes it really essential that we pick completely new forms of to attack and to defend ourselves as Black people. So that's really, like, that's the thing that colors my whole perspective on this topic. We have to innovate.
And just for the benefit of the viewers who aren't familiar, just say a little bit about who you are yourself, your work.
Okay, so I work in several spaces. I work in diversity, equity, and inclusion space as a teacher and trainer for the Maryland Equity and Leadership Program, which is a joint program between University of Baltimore and the Maryland Committee on Civil Rights. I also work for the Positive School Center as a trainer for school leadership around climate, racial justice, and restorative practice. I also serve as the president of the board for Fusion Partnerships, which is a local Black-led fiscal sponsorship organization with over 120 nonprofit projects that do work inside of Baltimore City and serve the people. Many of those programs you are familiar with. And in general, I'm a mediator and just a great guy. You got to put that part in there.
I believe that. All right, let's go to Danielle. Again, just kind of introduce yourself briefly, who you are, your work, and then just your reaction to the beginning.
Sure. So again, I'm Danielle Torain. I'm the director for the Open Society Institute of Baltimore. It's a foundation here based in Baltimore, but it's actually a part of a global network of foundations, a part of the larger Open Society foundations. We are what we call a place-based foundation. So we have a very specific focus on Baltimore City, and then also working in partnership with community to drive our investment strategies. So that's a little bit about who we are. I enter into this work from a number of different spaces. So over time, I've worked in local government. I've also worked in nonprofit management and at the community level. I've also worked in philanthropy and also think tanks. And so I've moved through a lot of different spaces in Baltimore over time. But the theme of, I think my path has always been one of kind of being more behind the scenes, but being on the side of building institutions, building systems, working in partnership with folks to really work through more consensus-based models and models of participatory planning to actually build and re-envision kind of strategy for around a range of different issues. And although I'm young, in that little bit of time, I think I've just seen a lot. Especially like we've all seen collectively a lot, even in the past, 5 or 6 years in Baltimore. And we've learned a lot about the power and the importance of institutions, especially in their connection with our ability to organize and build power as a community. I'll just share as a note, just a few quick definitions of what we're talking about when we say infrastructure. So there are a few that I'll just offer to our audience. So one, infrastructure in terms of social change. Infrastructure is an interconnected web of organizational structures, capacities, and functions necessary to affect lasting and meaningful progressive change in society. So when you think about it, there are a range of different organizational structures that you may think about, range of different capacities, both individually and collectively, that you may think about. They also, when we think about infrastructure, we often think about it in, we kind of hear the term in a physical sense, like physical infrastructure. You kind of think about power and water and electricity and all of these different things. And the act of depriving us as a community from any of those elements of physical infrastructure, we can immediately almost think about the ways that it impacts like our ability to, like our well-being, right? In this context, we're talking about social infrastructure. We're talking about people, institutions, systems that affect our ability to broker access to resources and networks and information and things like that. And so I just want to offer that as a kind of a note in terms of definition. And when we unpack this, there's a tremendous history both in Baltimore, but globally in terms of the attack of Black-led or Black and Brown-led infrastructure. So you think about the bombing of our churches, the underinvestment in our educational institutions. You talk about underinvestment in our neighborhoods, and even restrictions placed on things like public dollars, like in order to accept those dollars, like what we have to accept in terms of conditions and how that impacts our ability to organize. So I'll just offer those as a few reflections just to open up.
Right, appreciate that. So now let's go to Bakari. Again, just tell the folks who you are, about your work, and just your reactions to the kind of beginning commentary.
Yeah, so one, I just gotta say thank you to LBS as always for bringing us together, creating space for us to have dialogue. I think it's very, very necessary. I'm gonna come hopefully full circle back to part of the reason I think it's necessary for us to kind of have these safe but still like experimental spaces. So background wise, I studied, Black studies and business, and I feel like those are pretty much the spaces that I found myself operating in the most. Individually, I'm a small business consultant. I consider or call the sessions that I host with clients to be idea mapping. And it's really just like one-on-one to help clients, individuals talk through projects and ideas, and just get feedback about whatever the idea is or the mission is that they kind of want to bring to fruition. As somebody that's a starter, so some of the things that I've started, one has been Boys of Baltimore, which is a safe space for masculine women and trans men. More recently, an event series called Her Sweet Release for Black women who love Black women. And electronically, what I'm hoping to get off the ground very soon is more of a digital space online, specifically for Black-owned Baltimore. So I had the novel idea to purchase the domain blackownedbaltimore.com, and that is essentially right now what I'm working on, to really just try to have a central location for us to go, to not only just see those businesses, find those businesses, but to try to figure out the ways that we can constructively leave feedback, get those wraparound services that we need to grow and sustain our businesses as well. So I'm also on the advisory board for YES, which is a Youth Empower Society. It's a homeless youth drop-in center here. We know that we have a disproportionate amount of homeless youth that are Black, and then out of that segment, we have another further disproportionately marginalized group of folks that are LGBTQ that are homeless as well. So all those intersections are pretty much where my work is around. What comes to mind for me within that, the Ella Baker, just sort of like background that you shared is the safe space that I think in a lot of ways the Black church has provided us. Like that's been our infrastructure. I think all of us kind of had that cultural understanding from a historic standpoint. And as a lot of us start to explore more African-centered practices, we're finding ourselves away from that specific institution. And I think in some ways, one, I'm curious about like where we're tithing, right? Like, are we still tithing where we, spending those dollars? We know we can hop on board, become sustainers with LBS as one of the places that we can pull those dollars. But where are we putting that money? And for me, it's, I'm appreciative that Danielle read the actual definition of infrastructure. And one of the things that I think about is, from an infrastructure standpoint, where do we have the safe space to be experimental? Having, received my master's degree in business, it was really apparent to me that most of the white men that I was in school with, they had access to more capital, and two, they had access to more capital to F up, if I, just language right? They had the opportunity, a safe space to just mess up money. And I'm not advocating that we go and mess up money and waste dollars by any means, but the safe space to really be experimental. And some of the ways we best learn is through experimentation. And so that's one of the spaces that I'm most interested in. And again, a safe space that could look like micro grants, which I think collectively is doing a lot of work around. But what does that look like for us to have space intentionally created for us to learn? In the tech space is considered like agile, right? So you're doing short little sprints, over the course of a couple of weeks from problem, this first part of the problem going from from point A to point B. All right, now we're going to go from point B to point C. So I'm really excited about what that looks like from a structure standpoint, for us to have those spaces for us to just like learn from those things that are labeled as failures, but we know that that's all just feedback that we can reincorporate and then kind of power ourselves forward.
Appreciate that. Appreciate that.
Yeah.
All right. I guess we got, last but not least, we got the illustrious Heber Brown III, my pastor. Tell people who you are out. Did you hear the intro, the thing to react to?
I did, and apologies, I was having some tech issues, but I think I got most of what was shared through the Collective Courage excerpt.
Mm-hmm.
So, okay, good. So, good evening, everybody. I'm grateful to be on and to share with you. My name is Heber Brown III. I'm blessed to serve as pastor of the Pleasant Hope Baptist Church, and also I do work and show up with the Black Church Food Security Network, which seeks to organize and mobilize the resources and assets of Black church spaces around Black food and land sovereignty. And with respect to the comments, I mean, I'm grateful for the co-panelists tonight. Y'all was hitting. I just want to say amen and ashe to all that y'all said, from Brother Changa. I mean, from the very beginning, from innovation to definitions around infrastructure beyond brick and mortar, to where the safe space is to experiment. I'm just really grateful for how those things are pointed out. And Davon, you starting with and lifting up not only that quote, but also you talked about the Montgomery Bus Boycott. And I just want to lift up, in the spirit of that infrastructure that goes beyond brick and mortar, in the spirit of innovation, in the spirit of spaces where you can experiment, I want to lift up as an example Mrs. Georgia Gilmore, who is not a part of many of the headlines when you talk about the Montgomery Bus Boycott. But Mrs. Georgia Gilmore and her alliance of largely Black women, they were selling meals to raise money in support of the boycott. And the totals of how much they made through selling meals were announced at many of the weekly mass meetings at the church. And she called it the club from nowhere, to protect the identities of the other Black women who are participating from their lane of expertise and genius to support this action. And so I think that's an example. When I think about innovation, infrastructure, and safe spaces to experiment and put resources together to address present challenges, I think people like Mrs. Georgia Gilmore should also be honored and studied. And let me also say, in terms of the church, you know, when I went to the Civil Rights Museum in Birmingham, it's there where I learned that churches were supporting in other ways beyond just holding space for the mass meetings with the boycott. There were churches that also put money up to buy buses and buy vans. You know, because it's one thing to tell people stay off of white people's buses, but they still got to go to work. I still got to eat. And so, you know, providing, don't do that, but here's something you can do, I think is critical for, you know, and again, I wish I knew that earlier, but it was not until I went to the museum and read it and studied it there where it was like, wait, churches put money up to buy vans and buses to move Black folk around. We had a whole Black-led public transportation system. And so much of me laments the fact that it was let go after they won the fight, you know, with discrimination, because it provided that it was like, all right, you're going to do right by me, or we got this right here in our pocket. And so I'm really curious, I'm really eager rather to engage the brilliance of this body, and thank you for the invitation, but to engage the brilliance of this group around the question that you all raised as a topic in terms of, all right, what does it look like to put resources together for the daily needs of everyday folk? And I think that is as much a part of whatever revolutionary construction of what we need to create. I think that's just as revolutionary as any red, black, and green flag, or any ancestor altar, or any ashes that we can speak. Show me where the toilet paper and the sweet potatoes and my ride is, and that's just as revolutionary, I think.
So that's actually a perfect segue to kind of the first set of questions. So the way I want to kind of divide up the conversations is in two parts. So the first part, just want to deal with the kind of political aspect of it, right? Because I think a lot of times, you know, particularly in the context of like defund police, as I mentioned in the beginning, you know, a lot of the conversation is around this, you know, political aspect of, you know, challenging, you know, the police union, you know, challenging, you know, the kind of political machinations that keep law enforcement the way it is. And, you know, it's been my experience, both in terms of just studying and just my own work, you know, doing policy advocacy, that, you know, I feel like what I observe is that there's a whole lot more energy in the kind of political discussions around challenging white supremacy, right? And there's a lot of energy put in, and as a person who does it, like that's a part of my work, right? Like there's a lot of energy that's put into like the advocacy around, you know, telling people how certain systems, you know, perpetuate white supremacy. You know, so we talk about like police brutality, and we talk about the ways in which, you know, law enforcement, you know, collaborated with COINTELPRO and, you know, targets Black people and all that. And that now, you know, we see in the mainstream, you can turn on the 24-hour news cycle, right? And you see people talking about that. And as I started seeing more and more people talk about that, for me, it just started to make me question, like, how truly revolutionary is it, right? To be able to get on CNN or MSNBC and to talk about, you know, these structures of racism and white supremacy, like how revolutionary is it? And then as I started to watch more, it's like, oh, but nobody's talking about like what to replace this stuff with. You know what I'm saying? Like I'm not seeing the 5-minute long specials on like, here is how you do it instead. And in fact, one of the things that we saw was people kept talking about Camden, New Jersey. All right. And that was the example that was given for abolishing police. Because what Camden, New Jersey did was they essentially shut down their police department and got a surrounding county to then do its policing, and they replaced the police force. But what's so crazy about that is they returned to the same regime of policing, just a different agency, right? And so now we're actually seeing people post stories that say, oops, that actually wasn't what we were actually saying, right? So I guess what I would like you all to react to is that, you know, why do you all think that the conversation to Pastor Brown's point about like, what do you replace it with? Like, why is that conversation such a difficult conversation to have, even in social justice movement spaces where that's supposed to be where we're trying to go? So who wants to be the first to take that? You got it, Changa?
I mean, I have ideas, you know, for sure. So very closely akin to what Bakari is talking about, space to fail. There's also this piece around space to imagine, right? I am always a big proponent of displacement of a thing, not the tearing down. Like I don't need to tear down nothing. I don't need to tear down white supremacy. I just need to displace it with something that works better, with something that costs white people less, right? So that they will pile on, something that hurts Black people less, right? So that they will buy in. Because the truth is, human beings operate as human beings. Like we already know that there's no real difference. And so this idea of what comes instead of that has to start with giving us space like this right here, right now, space to imagine, right? And now that space to imagine has to be supported, back to Heber's point, by organizations, right? Who are capturing the best and brightest and posing this question to them in a full-time way and being able to support that with, is it a residency or is it a, you know, a year of, you know, whatever, similar to what OSI does with its fellows, and asking them a question and then funding the research and the imagination that goes into creating what's next, right? Specifically around the defunding of police, we know that there are several layers to what we have been asking police to do. We've been asking them to be mental health consultants, like on the spot care workers, which is absurd. We've been asking them to be conflict de-escalation specialists, which they have zero training for whatsoever. And we're asking them to be law enforcement, but we don't teach them the law. So that sounds like three. And then the thing that they actually are good at is being bouncers or thugs, right? So that's the thing that's the lowest thing for them to reach to. And so that's what they're really good at. And I'm not saying that we don't need the thugs. Like there's some people that you probably, you know, need to dial the 911 and the 1 for them. But that's probably a very small section of the population. And so we just need to break out. Defunding police just means breaking out the almost $1 billion that's going to the thug department and spread it out over these other 3 areas. And so it really won't take us a lot of imagination to figure out how to do that, I don't think, in Baltimore. So that's just with the police piece. But then when we talk about the more general space of actually building Black power, I really don't think it has anything to do with white institutions or white power structures at all. I think that we already have all of the money that we need in our pockets, and we just have to change the minds and hearts of Black and brown people.
You want to say something, Danielle?
Yeah, I totally agree, and I was going to just add the just a layer of economics as well. So when you kind of drop back and place this back into a historical context, you think about the structures that we move through and the spaces that we move through and that would become accustomed to as people. They have largely been shaped by a very a system of exploitation and a system of capitalism that intentionally reduces folks to kind of their least imaginative, their most productive, right? You know, in terms of, you know, whoever is in a position of control. And we move through these spaces every day. When you think about what it actually is going to take to get folks into a more imaginative space, we actually have to talk about how to make folks whole. And I'm talking about whole in terms of, you know, financially whole, spiritually and relationally whole, you know, in a space where they can actually rest and think and see in a different way, you know. And I'll tell you, like, as a funder, there are so many stories of folks who are just working so hard on these causes, but also working so hard to make ends meet that they feel stretched. And I can't tell you how many folks that I've talked to, especially within the past couple of months, that have said, I don't know how I'm actually going to sustain myself through this next leg, right? Like this next leg of the journey. I don't know how to pause, to be able to rest enough to be in my most imaginative space and my most generative space when we think about, you know, reimagining these systems and actually, you know, thinking about these systems and types of infrastructure in a way that truly makes a shift. And so we really have to think about how to resource ourselves as a community so that we also are giving out our best thinkers and our most imaginative folks the ability and the space to actually kind of see and perceive all of this in a different way. I'll also share that the importance of analysis as well. So as we've been talking about defund and as we've been talking about the issue of policing, in a lot of these spaces, I've also heard a lack of kind of connection between, you know, the issue of policing and law enforcement and the issue of markets. like what actually is going to take to reduce our reliance on systems of incarceration, for example, and shift into different economic models. And we have a lot of the best thinkers out there, but it's a matter of freeing them up to be able to really offer that perspective and elevate that into the mainstream, so that we're learning from that and can really see that as we chart our path forward, you know?
So one thing I want to say before I, get to maybe a couple of other panelists on this issue is that, and this is one of the things that Changa said. One of the complicated things for LBS is that we're often kind of straddling the line between the importance of building independent Black institutions, but also the idea that we're governed in a society where their policies impact like how things operate, right? And one of the things that I think is underutilized is the importance of using, the resources that our tax dollars provide to the government and finding creative, productive ways to use that as investment. Because in many respects, it's the resources that are a lot of the resource that's available, at least to Black people, to be able to get some of the seed capital necessary to be able to push forward some of the things that we need. And also it's the public sector that governs so much of Black people's lives, right? And so that's one of the things that, like, as we, and when we talk about even having enough resources, because I think Black folks, we have more than we know we have, but I actually don't think we have nearly enough. One of the things that I advise people to check out, Dr. Jared Ball over at Morgan State University just published The Myth of Black Buying Power, right? Where what he talks about is the fact that, and particularly in radical political settings, a lot of times, the amount of money we have, or the idea that all we got to do is spend our money right, will provide liberation for Black people. And so that's kind of where the public policy is. This is a country that produces $23 trillion in gross domestic product. We need as a community to use the tools of policy to extract as much of those resources, but also being able to do that while building our own institutions. And that's, I think, a difficult challenge and a difficult balance. And so again, I just wanted to add that to the conversation as well as to, why it's so important to build independent Black infrastructure. Bakari or Heber, y'all want to jump in at all before we get to the next piece? Go ahead, Bakari.
So I can't do anything other than just like co-sign the things that you all have already said. I want to, I guess if anything, just kind of speak to, I think, more of the imagination piece. And I think Changa was spot on. And I think Changa, said that we have the resources that we need. And then Davon is, incredible that you just highlighted the myth of Black buying power. I think we're also at an interesting shift. We see so many systems in the US crumbling. And I think if we're not witnessing it in our lifetime, I think we're definitely at the beginning of seeing capitalism begin to crumble, which is interesting because I think that for us, I've heard so many comedians say jokingly that, Black folks found out about the recession and it was really nothing that was different in our day-to-day lives, right? Like we were already experiencing a recession before they, announced it, so to speak, on the news. But it's something that I've realized and just have been thinking more about is just like how many of us really practice socialism, right? Like how many of us by default are practicing socialism? And so I think when we get into that space from an imaginative space, and I would say have developed new applications for existing technology that will allow us to leverage social capital, I think that's going to, because we already know, like we know that inspiration wise and imagination wise, we are funding and fueling so many things in the US, right? Music, culture, food, the arts, like we're funding and creating all of those things. Like they're all byproducts of Black experiences. So I think once we have another sort of leg up on technology, I would say that one of the gaps that we have is the technology piece. And I think we have those resources within our community, but they're not necessarily as widespread. I think there's still more of a learning curve when it comes to technology and how we can start to leverage it. But I think that's one of the things that I think have a whole lot of potential around, right? So imagination, and I think you asked the question, what's holding us back? And I think part of that is gumption, right? It's one thing to say we know that this is wrong, but who has the courage to actually be the first person to be a front runner to step out and do something different, right? In the business space, it's considered the first mover advantage. If it works, then you get the first mover advantage. If it fails, you look like an idiot, right? And so how many of us are actually willing to take that risk when, and Danielle kind of highlighted, when, you know, you've scrounged all of your resources and pooled them into this one idea, you know, you really can't afford to the perception, I should say, is that you can't afford to fail. So I think a lot of that imagination has to look like imagination on the individual level, imagination on the family level, and then imagination on a community level. And I saw somebody in the comments bring up the Susu. And I think that community-wise, I think that a Susu I think we have potential there. Personally, I think we have the potential to reimagine what credit looks like. I think leveraging Susus, and I think if we were to establish smaller Susus on, you know, the people that you're on group chat with, if you've established Susu with those folks and then started to branch those out, I think we had, you know, we could really start to leverage some our capital in different spaces there. But I think it's imagination also coupled with gumption. And I definitely feel like technology, to Changa's point, is going to be leveraged in that space, right? We know we have to be beyond just like showcasing modern day lynchings on the media. That's just not going to cut it. That's not alerting, you know, and informing anyone really anymore. So how can we leverage the existing technology in new and creative ways? So I just wanted to add that into the space.
Heber, you know, one thing that, you know, you and I have talked about is, you know, when you started the Black Church Food Security Network, I remember, you know, the conversation we had, you were just at a point where you're like, look, I'm tired of banging on the system. Everybody doing that. You know what I'm saying? I'm gonna go over here and go build this thing. And I remember, you know, a few years into you doing it, you know, another conversation we had, you were like, I'm looking around, I'm seeing all the people that was talking all this bang on the system stuff, right? And that stuff ain't nearly as steady. And whereas the progress you were making with the Black Church Food Security Network, like the way that you were able to see the sustainable change in that. Could you just talk a little bit just about, like, you know, how you made that pivot and decided, you know what, I'm gonna just, you know, I'm gonna go here, because I think it jives with everything that we're talking about.
Sure. Let me start where Bakari kind of ended up talking about gumption. I love your comment there, Bakari, about just really having the gumption. Because connected to that, Davon, it's like, in terms of my journey, that piece of my journey that you referenced anyway, you know, I had to have the gumption to be a whole clown out here, like, for real. Like, pastors don't do this. What are you doing?
Mm-hmm.
Like, this is not the way to become one of the religious fathers of the Black church community in a city like Baltimore, or even beyond. It's like, what are you doing? Don't you want to be like a big mega pastor with a big mega congregation and have your name in lights and here you out here with sweet potatoes and overalls and a pickup truck? Oh, what are you doing? And especially in that beginning part, you know, just had like, I ain't gonna say it was easy. I'm definitely not gonna say it wasn't easy. It was not easy. But going back to what Changa, one of your first comments, Changa, you was talking about innovating. And I think when I think about innovating, sometimes I think about DJs, and for a DJ to be someone who's good at innovating, they got to know what the original was. They got to know what the earlier versions were. And so what happened to me was ancestors who were pastors in Black churches grabbed hold of me, and during that study of their story, Vernon Johns, Albert Clegg, and so many others who were religious leaders and farmers, and were making the connection around agricultural resistance and owning land and growing your own food as a pathway to building power. It just ignited something within me that I'm grateful that, you know, that we've stayed with it and stuck with it to this point in time, because now what started out as one church, Pleasant Hope in Baltimore, now is other churches in Baltimore. We're about to launch a 3-acre farm in Baltimore. We got churches in Georgia, in North Carolina, Virginia. I was on a call today with bishops and leaders of national Christian organizations because of the widespread disillusionment now in the Black community with the systems and with politics.
I mean, this is a beautiful time for what we're doing, because people are like, okay, wait a minute, there's a virus, there's this political system that's whack, my grocery store is making me wait in line, my job situation is tenuous, I need to eat. And I don't know if I want to go hear that brother preach, but at least I know he got some potatoes over there at that spot. And so I think, you know, even in the spirit of what you were saying, Danielle, in terms of how do we understand infrastructure, being able to feed yourself is very important in that equation. And let me say very quickly that also when it comes to kind of building out the infrastructure and really thinking along these lines, I think space needs to be made for us to talk about the ways in which our imagination is colonized, and how, you know, the police are in our heads. And I wonder, you know, just how much we can just confess that there's some shackles on our imagination, and we dream to a limit. And I'm not even gonna say it's to any particular fault of our own, but this, I think that the venom of the situation that we're in, I just love to make space for just considering that we can only dream but so far because of what we're in. And so making space to kind of detoxify our minds, getting some space there, I think is equally important to all that has been shared already as well.
So just a quick note to the audience. I'm gonna ask one more question, and then I'm encourage you all to put some questions in the chat, and you know, we'll ask some of the questions that the viewers have. So this one last question, and folks can kind of answer in any order. You know, what are some of the, you know, like as I mentioned before, there's certain skills that it takes to do like advocacy and all that stuff. But you know, as I understand it, infrastructure, there are different skills and different competencies it takes in terms of like building infrastructure. Could you all speak to, I guess it's a two-part question. One, what are some of those skills? Like, what are some of those skills that are important for infrastructure development that aren't as talked about enough in spaces where we're talking about social movements? And what are some of the biggest challenges to build an infrastructure? I know, you know, we've talked about, you know, imagination. You know, Pastor Brown just talked about, you know, the way that our minds are colonized, which I think is like ubiquitous. I mean, I think that's a place we should all start in terms of how we even imagine a world. But yeah, those two questions. What are the skills for infrastructure building that's important for people to have in mind? And what are some of the more concrete examples of barriers there are to the work of infrastructure development? Who wants to start? All right, let me go with, I don't think we heard from
Danielle.
Go ahead, Changa.
I knew you were going to do that, Changa. So I knew that's what he was going to do. So I was actually thinking about, because Davon, you've often asked this question, and I think as you were stating the question, I was actually thinking about a few conversations we've had where you've said, you got to write this down, or we got to talk about this a little bit more. We got to educate others. And so often when you've said that to me, I will sit and say, wow, okay, so what is it though? Like, what is the nature of this work? And the reason why I actually think sometimes it's hard to define, especially as Black people in this work, is that when you look at the larger body of literature on things like, as Changa said, organizational development, change management, institution building, you know, it's very whitewashed, to be honest, right? It's with a very kind of Western philosophy on what an organization looks like. It is very based on very Eurocentric, you know, values. And I remember reading a lot of it and just not being able to find myself in that research and that literature. And for that reason, not being willing to name myself, you know, or to use any of those terms to describe the work. I just prefer to do the work, and you call it whatever you want to do, right? But what I also would say is that what I struggle with is a lot of times folks will reduce it to like almost a technical kind of work, right? They're just like, you're just kind of putting widgets together and kind of building structures and things like that. But when I'm honest, and a lot of people don't like when I respond, you know, to these questions in this way, this work is work of the spirit. Like, there's no, like Bakari mentioned, like working as a consultant. I also worked as a consultant for some time, and in order to do that work, I actually had to sit with the folks I was working with. Like I had to be there with them. I had to listen. I had to dream with them and vision and kind of understand their culture and their philosophy and their values and what they love to do, how they laugh, you know, how people interact, and get a feel for the people first and then their vision. And then you kind of see with folks, and then you kind of work backward from that to say, okay, what do we need to build to support not only what folks are trying to accomplish, but how they would like to accomplish it, and what types of structures they envision to anchor that, right? So then when you start breaking that down, there's a spiritual element to it, like really like understanding and connecting with people. There's a relational element to this work. That's really important, being in community with folks, getting to know folks and who they actually are at their best. And then you have the layer of all of like the technical elements, right? So you talk about finance and operations and the legal side of things, and especially in the given the context in which we operate, you have to understand the larger macro kind of policy frameworks, even like issues of regulations and legal frameworks, and how that impacts policy, and then policy and how that impacts practice, and how that impacts behavior, and then how we build, right? And so I think all of those kind of pieces kind of meld together in this work of building infrastructure, at least for Black and Brown communities. And I think it's important actually that that question is asked more, because I think about a lot of folks in this work that would probably answer the question in slightly different ways, and rightfully so, because I think that there's so many different ways of approaching this work and so many different types of important contributions to this work. And so I'll start by offering that. I'm interested to hear what everybody else that thinks as well.
I love that that piece where you introduce spirit as a mandatory entry point, right? And I would separate skills, Davon, from mindset or practices, because I could teach you how to be a mechanic. I could teach you how to turn bolts and put things together, but you will never reach the Kung Fu level of mechanic if you're not there, like in the mindset of gears and this kind of thing. You just will never get there. And so when we're talking about in the space of how do we, somebody put it really well in the comments, how do we liberate our imagination, right? There's a mindset of freeness, right? Freedom, which gets you to that imaginative space. But there's also this mindset of shrewdness. And Black people, we just want to give everything away, and that is, I feel like that is a remnant of the slavery times, because you don't own nothing. Like if you came up with something, or you imagined a new way to do something, or you did something better or whatever, like that there's going to be a violent ripping of that from your psyche if they could, right? But certainly from your hands. And I think that reverberates today. So I think that we need to decolonize that idea, right? This piece of shrewdness, meaning that when we have something, it is not to be given away. It's to be guarded until such time as it can be cultivated to properly serve the entire people, and this is something that I'm sure Heber, learning the 14 cents an hour farming, is that cultivation is a like, it's a thing, like it's a real process that you must be, when you say a good steward, this takes the idea of a good steward to another level, right? Meaning that you have to guard those plants or those things as they grow, and you have to be shrewd. You have to be, something that I keep saying shrewdness because I really don't have a better word, but there's this piece where we are not guarded. Like we are defensive about everything, but there's a difference about, like, I know I have a value and I'm going to guard that value. And so we have to, and as you can see, I'm struggling even with the language of that. So we have to get that language and get that mindset, as well as this imagination piece. But then when we do drop down to skills for building an infrastructure, there is, you know, this is where my lane is, right? This conflict resolution piece. There are people who have fruitful relationships that they've developed over years and throw them away over nothing. And this is something that's very common in our particular space. And we really just got to get past that, y'all, because we are really wasting precious time and precious energy. And I'm not saying that every relationship has to go the distance for 30 years and what have you. But what I'm saying is that conflict resolution is a skill where I can see you in all your faults. And even if the beautiful things about you don't outweigh your faults in my mind, I still don't throw the whole you away. And so I guess that's both a skill and a mindset, right? So the skill of conflict resolution and the mindset of everybody has value and they're not to be thrown away. I probably could go on, but I'm gonna stop right there.
Davon, can I just
Changa,
go ahead, Bakari.
I was gonna hop right in where Changa left off. I actually wrote down griots and gatekeepers. And I feel like I love astrology, disclaimer. So I'm a Sagittarius rising, right? So the centaur energy, we got arrows and we want to put them in the bow and just go for it. And I have to really kind of sit down a lot of times and try my best to focus that energy. And one of the things that I feel like I've learned in the journey, I think, of advocacy, which I think everybody in this space is along, is that we need like the griots to actually tell us like, nah, you probably don't want to do that. I did that back in '95 and this is how it played out, or, you know, whatever the case may be. So I think in a lot of instances, we need those griots. And I think there are a lot of texts that we need to read to gain that historical context. But I say griots specifically because I think when you feel that sense of urgency, which I think so many of us do, right? You have that fervor, you have that passion when you are ready to go. It takes a certain amount of discipline to sit down and read the book. And I think there's a time for that. And I think there's also the time for elders in our community to also just kind of pull us aside and school us on what's what. So griots in that capacity. And then I think gatekeepers, you know, to Changa's point about how we are more than defensive, to his point, you know, I think really protective and willing to say like, no, you cannot come into this space. This is something that's sacred. And this is why we've defined it. This is how we've defined it as sacred. This is why we've defined it as sacred. And even if we haven't shared that with you, the answer is no, you can't come through. So I think in a lot of ways, those are some of the skills that we need when it comes to that infrastructure. And I think, you know, everybody's already kind of acknowledged the need for specifically decolonizing our imagination in that space. But I think we need that Sankofa, right? We need like that cultural memory. And so what does that mean in those spaces holistically for us to pull back and recall, yes, I had that my time of study to actually be in the text, but I'm also in community enough where some of those messages and some of those stories are being transmuted amongst ourselves, right? So that we have that level of collective knowledge as well. And Changa mentioned earlier that, you know, from a technology standpoint, we had word of mouth. Word of mouth is just as fast today, I would say, if not faster, you know, when we couple it, you know, in the form of a DM than it was back in 1960. So those are the two things that I will offer that are the skills. And it may be oversimplified, but I think we also have a level of space with ego and ignorance. And I'm speaking just for myself in that space in terms of barriers. Those are barriers that I found related to infrastructure. It's been a certain level of ignorance. I really didn't know, that didn't cross my mind. I was unaware. And ego, again, with that starter energy, thinking, I got something that's new and improved. And again, since you need to go back to the text and reevaluate before coming in. So those are the two things that I want to share.
You want to go, Danielle?
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on, because I know you there were two parts to your question, Davon, and I just wanted to pick up on what I think you mentioned or asked about challenges. And I just wanted to note, like, you know, I really believe we have a lot of excellent examples of how we have always built as a people, right? Like built infrastructure. We have birthed many of our greatest ideas, you know, as a country and even globally. And but there's a reason why a lot of that history has been hidden from us, or and there's a reason why it is often hard to find. And I think that when you think about why, I think we have to have more honest conversations about not only racism, but white supremacy, but also the role of patriarchy and gender dynamics in terms of Black women in particular, and how they show up in this work and why they are not recognized more often for the roles that they play. I can't tell you how frustrated I often am to see Black women in particular behind the scenes, like giving their ideas, lending their labor, building, resourcing, healing, creating space, holding space for, and never named for the role that they actually play, and never really recognized for the critical nature of that role, that work. I've also come from spaces where oftentimes that the nature of that role, there's almost a kind of a line that's drawn between, like, you know, the strategist or the implementer, or, you know, kind of the practical versus the visionary, right? And somehow, you know, I find that, you know, Black people and Black women in particular are often relegated to that space of the practical. You can execute, but you weren't necessarily the person that, you know, came up with the idea, which is not true, right? And so I think we actually have to be really honest about that, and then again, place it into a historical context and have an honest conversation about Black labor, Black women's labor, and what that how that has been exploited in this country and used in this country, and how that has become our culture and our way of being, even within the context of the Black community, right? So we have to unpack that so that we see each other, and that we see more accurately our history of this work. And then also in present day, you know, we still kind of work in a context where, you know, I watch so many of our most brilliant thinkers, most innovative folks, spending so much of their time trying to fix a system that is desperately broken. As Bakari said, it's breaking down. We're seeing it, we're watching it happen right now. But many of us are in roles where we're trying to, like, kind of fix what exists rather than stepping away to say, no, y'all, like, as a community, we got to figure out a strategy to actually protect more space and time and disconnect from that work to actually shift our energy into, like, more of kind of building for our future, right? And I believe that actually takes, that is a collective work, because it does take more honest conversation about how we're all situated, what we need in order to create more of that space. And then there is the element of risk. Someone brought up earlier the risky nature of it, the fact that we often cannot step out there and be the first. And there's some very real examples of, like, even in Baltimore, like, attempts to build new and different organizations and businesses, and those institutions and businesses coming under attack in very real ways. And absent a more collective effort, there's no way to actually protect these folks who are trying to do the work, right? So I just want to offer some of those thoughts as just like one element of, you know, kind of like what are the challenges to do in this work, to add, like, you know, another layer to our conversation.
For sure. I also wanted to keep it a buck and say that one of the reasons why we are allowed to tout Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, you know, the heroes of February, right? One of the reasons we're allowed to continue those narratives is because they got shot, right? And so there's an implication there. Like, let's just really be clear. Like, there's an implication there. If I do something that upsets the Bob Embry in Baltimore, right, and shifts some money or shifts some power, like, I'm sure there's an uncle or a grandson that's, or whatever, who is in the the police department, who can pull me over when he's ready and does, you know, do what he wants to do. Like, all of that is still real. And so when we start talking about barriers, like, we got to start at, like, number one. Like, number one, you could get shot. It's still Baltimore, right? And so that's still there. And so just to have a conversation like we're having is not without its gravity. I'll just say. The other thing is revealing and reinstituting the presence of indigenous practices, right? So there's plenty of indigenous practices that are currently in place in all the halls of power. And so we should be revealing those, like as much as we possibly can, just to give people back their identity, right? And to understand that you already have power. What are you waiting for? Like, power is not going to come in an envelope in the mail. Like, you already have it, so you have to exercise it. And then reinstituting. So I heard a mention of Susu earlier, and you know, Susu. I'm just going to pick that example of many, but Susu is being used in a marketing scheme kind of way, like a what do we call this thing? The pyramid scheme kind of way. Yeah, exactly. In this day and age, it's not only being used there; it's being used in some pro-social active ways to build some things. But we have to also understand. Malidoma Somé said in the Water and Spirit, he gave us this understanding that the Western civilization, America in general, to the African, is very much like a radioactive. You know, it's like a contaminated space. And so being in it over a period of time, there's no way that you're not gonna need to go back to the water and to cleanse yourself. Now, God forbid those folks who were born and baptized and have only known the contaminated areas, right? And I'm talking about physically, right? Food deserts, right? I'm talking about intellectually, Baltimore City Public Schools, and then I'm talking about spiritually, white Jesus, right? And I'm talking about in community in general. So when people have these several layers going on, this we would call it comorbidity, right? In a medical or research context, we would say comorbidity. You have one thing that's bad, but if you have two acting on you at the same time, and many of us have so many, so we have to go back to our indigenous things that help us come back to ourselves. And I think we just would be remiss if we didn't bring that in as a part of infrastructure.
So I want to just make a comment and then ask another question that tries to tie in some of the questions that I'm seeing in the chat. You know, one of the things that I'm glad has come up is really this concept of decolonization. And one of the things that I know has frustrated me is that, you know, in many mainstream intellectual spaces, a lot of folks' awareness of the world is contained within the knowledge of the West, right? So there isn't a whole lot of knowledge that I think is widely understood to be essential as a learned person in mainstream civil society, where you got to know some of the ways in which highly advanced ancient African nations do governance, right? I was even I'm actually doing research on something comprehensive that I'm gonna write for some of the work we're going to do in Annapolis, and looking at how ancient African civilizations dealt with crime and punishment, right? And it's unfortunate that one of the impacts of white supremacy on kind of our collective imagination is that, you know, as a society, folks don't think there's anything to learn from Africa and indigenous people that could be useful for today. You know, and so one of the things, you know, I saw some of the questions in the chat about, like, what are some things for folks to read? You know, there's a whole lot of, you know, texts that I think are going to be important that really help provide templates for how to engage in alternative forms of human organization that I think are very important, particularly when we look at how to build institutions. You know, how you build them there are ways in which folks have built institutions and the remnants of them stick with us today. So the question I want to put, because everybody kind of talked about this notion of, you know, reimagination, you know, kind of challenging the colonialism on our minds. would you all comment on just your own journeys in that decolonization for yourself in your respective fields of work, and kind of target that conversation in the context of this conversation about like infrastructure. So when you think about like your own journey and how you got to a place where you had some awareness of this colonization, right? Like, why did that lead you to the importance of the idea of building infrastructure? Because there are lots of things that, you know, doing, you know, I think all of us, many of us have gone through the process of like reading. So I know for me, it was college where I read some books. It was like, oh snap, and I didn't know any of this stuff, you know. And there are different ways people can go when they get that. So what was it in your own journey of kind of decolonizing your own mind that you said yourself, oh, you know what, we gotta build, you know? So who wants to be the first to take that?
I'll jump in.
Go ahead, go ahead.
So you make me smile because for me, it was travel. So when I went to seminary at Virginia Union, they had a course on African traditional religions in Ghana. And one of my professors encouraged me to take the course. So we went to Ghana, and it was there that my eyes opened real wide, far beyond the Baltimore bubble that I had grown up in, and the church bubble, the Black church bubble I grew up in. And yes, so that's what happened for me. And I'll tell you, that experience was transformative. And I came back to the States after that first trip, and my parents and family sent Heber Brown to go to Ghana. But when I came back, I was Kwabena Omowole, and my beard was grown out on my face. I was not going to any white folks' establishments. I remember, and Devon, you've heard me talk about this, I believe, in sermons and stuff, that it was like a brand new experience, a brand new world. Everything was wrong. I am ready to fight the system. And, you know, with life experience and just continuing to read, continuing to travel, continuing to live and be honest with myself, that fire yet remains. But how it demands attention is no longer in that same way. I was tempted to wear dashiki tonight because Davon was moderating, but I said, you know what, I don't even need it. I'm just gonna be. No, but you know, so that was a part of my journey. And as I studied, the more I read and studied and traveled, I just really got convinced. And I think I could almost point to the day. We were going to Annapolis. Matter of fact, it was 2015. Mm-hmm. It was 2015, and it was when uprisings were happening all over the country. We were working together, LBS, bunch of different groups. We were all working together to try to get legislation passed around police accountability, transparency, et cetera. I think we had 17 some bills in 2015. And one of our pushes to the legislators was, look, y'all see what's going on around the country. You do know Baltimore can pop off like this too. And our bills weren't moving. We were spending money buying buses and feeding everybody. People were taking off from work to come down to testify before people who were not even looking them in their eye. They were on their phones. They would leave the room. We had to wait to the end of the night to testify for 3 minutes apiece. And all of that work going on. And I remember at the time, Delegate Barbara Robinson was the head of the Legislative Black Caucus. And I remember asking her with frustration, I said, Delegate Robinson, what's going on? We got all these bills. The bills aren't moving out of committee. They see what's happening in Ferguson and other places, and nothing's going on here. And Delegate Robinson told me, she said, Reverend Brown, when the police union doesn't like a bill, we can't pass it. It was right at that moment that I realized that my civics teacher lied to me, that the social studies books lied to me, because I had believed up to that point that if you had the right argument, if you had the moral strength of your position, if you had a broad-based coalition, if the research and statistics backed you up, then naturally the next step is your bills pass and the change is made. But what she let me know was that white folk going white folk, no matter how articulate you, quote unquote, you think you are, no matter your oratorical skill, no matter your coalition, no matter how many social media retweets you get, that structure it knows how to be nimble and navigate around you. So it was about that time I said, you know what? I ain't come back down here no more, and Davon will be my witness. I
remember.
I don't go to a hearing. I don't do it. Now I respect it. I'm just saying I ain't going down there. But that was a part of my journey, and that's when I realized if we are to have anything, we have to build it for ourselves. And I had to get real about the fact that the fullness of what I see in my spirit, I won't see in the flesh. I had to get real about the fact that this is the kind of marathon that I'm not going to see the fullness of in my lifetime in this form. But our grandchildren, I believe, are depending on us to at least give the alley-oop, at least give a runway. And I think that's what our ancestors did. You've given us a tremendous runway. And I just pray to be able to do my part to add a few more bricks on that runway so they can take off and get some of the fruit of the labor today as well.
I think I'll jump in to add, I think that the experience that really opened my eyes was actually like taking on my first job in philanthropy. Not only was it culture shock, it was shocking in a number of ways. And I think that it was the experience of being in boardrooms and planning discussions and, things like that. And just hearing, quite honestly, how folks talked about Black people, like Black people, Baltimore, you know what I mean? Communities that I felt, that I came from, that kind of thing. And realizing, just seeing that truth in terms of the ways of thinking, the frame of mind, and the correlation between those deeply held beliefs and how capital flows and resources flow. So that was one aspect of it. Also just seeing and witnessing the growth disparity in terms of who we invest in and at what levels, right? So you're talking about seeing $1 million grants and, investments go out, like at a drop of a hat, like with, relationship and things like that. But a fight for a $20,000 grant, don't say general operating support, for a small grassroots business or organization here in Baltimore, the disparity is just so blatant and tremendous that it was just shocking. It was shocking to my conscience, and it kind of kicked me into overdrive in terms of saying you have to think about this in a different way. Also, I'll share one current statistic. Nationally, from private foundations, less than 2% of all philanthropic capital is actually devoted to Black communities. Now that may be changing with all of the national movement around Movement for Black Lives and other efforts to raise capital in this particular moment. But before all of that, 2%, less than 2% of all philanthropic capital goes to Black communities in this country. You just gotta sit with that. And that tells you something, right? So the irony of actually being in a lot of this position and speaking to folks a lot of times is that, I'm often the funder that will say, yeah, like, well, let's work on getting that grant, but this is not the solution. Let's find some ways to leverage some of these systems for whatever they can be leveraged for, but don't confuse that with the kind of long-term sustainable solution and the work that we really need to be doing around reimagining economies, building Black wealth, thinking about economic development, thinking about political empowerment. Like there's no conflating the two. It's not the same. I just believe we will never be truly liberated as a people if we're dependent on, ultimately someone else. to invest in us, right? And how other folks are investing in us, like it just is so rooted in such deeply held stereotypes and biases and beliefs about Black folks and Blackness that then gets tied into conversations about capacity, and in this context, institutional capacity and organizational capacity, and who's investment worthy and who's not. It was really that experience that opened my eyes. Yeah, so.
I would say for me in 2012, I was literally like outside of the Hippo at the let out, trying to get folks to sign petitions in support of marriage equality, right? Which we know ultimately got passed. And so being at this intersection of Black identity and LGBTQ identity, and so it wasn't at that particular moment, but it was the hot potato moment that happened right after marriage equality passed. And so as soon as that happened, the level of support that had been, I would say, wrapped around this intersection of Black and LGBTQ folks was just, the plug was just completely snatched out of those spaces. And so for me, I think it's a difference between like knowing and then experiencing that's something in that same way. And so for us, or I was outside organizing with other people that were Black like myself. And so I think that for us, that experience was like, okay, that's how it's the same. Oh, it's exactly the same. Okay, regardless, it's gonna be the same across the board. So for me, that was what that lived experience was. And I think for me, I'm in the space now of really trying to just sing more about that level of intersectionality. And so that understanding that MLK quote before he was killed, that, I fear I've integrated my people into a burning building. I don't necessarily think it's quite the extreme, but I think there are a lot of Black and brown LGBTQ folks who are coming into that, like, then second wave of consciousness. Like, you had that first, I would say, level of consciousness in terms of your Blackness, and then are understanding it a second, maybe even third time in terms of your identity when it comes to that LGBTQ identity as it relates to like that white adjacency, and that there being a very hard and fast line of distinction, which I'm sure that many of you all probably know, just based on the number of feminine people, trans folks that we see murdered all the time, that there's that same level of white fervor is not present to those particular LGBTQ issues. So that was, for me, that was it for me.
So I was getting a little wrapped up in the stories, but let me just make sure I got the question. The moment that just kind of pulled the wool back from your eyes, right?
Right. Particularly as it relates to your instinct to say we gotta build stuff. Right,
for ourselves. So I witnessed people building stuff, right? And I witnessed the contempt that they had for Black people, because Black people have been here X, Y, and Z amount of time, and y'all ain't built shit, and at first you bristle at that, and you're like, your defensive part goes up. But then when you just kind of see them as human beings and not as the enemy, you start to understand that, like, the way for us, cereal and milk go together, right? Like, that's just, we know that, right? And anybody who's not doing it that way is weird. However, that's just because it's not because it goes together. It's because that's what we've repeated enough times. And so I have a number of ways, because I don't, people don't understand this, but I'm more of a businessman than I am any kind of activist or any kind of anything else. Like, numbers are my friends. Like, you know what I mean? Like, so when I look at things, like, I have a good friend named Tate, who we met, we were 14, but he's white in Columbia, and I am where I am, West Baltimore, and Black. And we kept up with each other over the years. And when I know this guy. Like, I know who this guy is. I know I'm smarter than this guy. I know that I have a better lineage than him as far as what people have overcome and what have you in all the ways. And I know that when he was 21, he could get a mortgage working at Wawa. You know what I mean? Like, and I had no hope of that. You know, I was probably making double what he was making. I had no hope of signing Changa Onyango on no paper, nowhere at 21 and getting a mortgage. Like, that wasn't going to happen. And so when you understand glaringly like that, the difference, and I'm fortunate that I wasn't with a lot of the West Baltimore kids who were made to understand tacitly and insidiously over time that Africa was something to be ashamed of. I'm not that guy. I was like, from the time I was 5, Africa was made out to be heaven to me. I didn't know nothing about slavery. Nobody told me nothing about slavery. I was 15. So my understanding of Africans was like an aspiration, always, my whole life. And so when I did incur that, you know, that thing about how Black is not beautiful, I was like, that was weird to me. It was very weird. So I'm just saying that to understand that I have a space of privilege where I'm starting from, that a lot of people do not have, right? But when I got to a friend of mine's house and we were moving him out of town and he was selling his house, he said, the buyers are coming by. And who came in? A 19-year-old Vietnamese girl. She was the buyer. And I asked her, I was like, yo, like, how are you buying this house in Parkville in the 90s? Like that. So, you know, you have to understand Baltimore dynamics. Like, Parkville is where like all the cops live in Parkville. Like, you know, this is what have you. But she was buying it. She said, I got a loan from our bank. And I was like, oh, your family's rich. She was like, no, I work at a nail salon. But when I say our bank, I mean our people. Our people have their own bank here. I mean, how many of us know that Vietnamese people have a bank in Baltimore? You have no idea. So this goes to, and my battery is dying, but this goes to the witnessing what's really actually happening in other communities. When I understood that, and I understood that like these people could go and get money from their own bank, and then look at Tate and I say, oh, the reason he can sign for that is because that's his bank. And then I look at our bank. Okay, I'm gonna leave.
So we got a couple of additional questions that's in the chat. So I'll ask them and folks can decide which ones they want to address. One question that's in here, it seems to be, it looks like students that are working within white institutions that are looking for ways to figure out how to push from the inside. Like, how can they use the resources from the inside, you know, in order to push for change. So anybody want to speak to that for a second about, you know, what advice would you give some, you know, folks? So then I guess in this case, these are students, but just anybody who are working within institutions, what are some advice or suggestions you would give them to support kind of the perspective we talked about tonight?
I would say first and foremost, connect with organizations like LBS. I feel like, you know, I brought up earlier the notion of doing this work in community. So when you're working from the inside, it is really important to be really honest with yourself about what you are there to do, what you may not be able to do through those institutions, and then also to have very intentional conversations about the ways in which resources that you may have access to through those environments, through those institutions may be of service. I've always thought that, you know, kind of the notion of the inside outside kind of dynamic is really important. And I think it's important for us to continue to cultivate spaces where we can come together, talk about all of our collective capabilities, and to come to consensus around the role that we each can play in a moment like this to be of service. So to those students, I would say, just continue to stay connected to these dialogues and these spaces where you can continue to learn the context in which you are doing that work, and then also ask for, feedback and input to really determine how to best leverage a position in this particular time to be of service. So that's what I will offer.
One other person want to say something about that? So, you want to say something, Chang? So let me, I guess while Chang is getting some of the tech stuff together. We have another question in here. And I'm not sure I entirely understand the question, but it's asking the question about the relationship between resources and making change. What part does wealth and money play in long-term structural change towards equity? Does wealth, income, equality go hand in hand with racial equity? One thing I want to add to that question is, I think, we had this conversation, we talked about capitalism. And I think a lot of times one of the things that I think is a very difficult line to walk is the importance of making money in a society where you got to pay your bills, right? But understanding the importance of anti-capitalism, right? And understanding that capitalism is inherently a system that is exploitative and anti-human. And so I think sometimes that's a difficult, so I think that's probably a way to really get to that question when we talk about like wealth and money. And then we talk about how does that, what is the relation between that and social change? And how do you walk that tightrope of like building wealth, but understanding the ills of capitalism?
I feel like that one is so tough, because we have our day-to-day needs, like Pastor Brown said, the toilet paper, the sweet potatoes, the day-to-day things that we actually need, or that we rely on capital to procure. I think it's really at this point, I think we're looking at capital as a means to be a buffer. And I think Danielle kind of touched on this earlier, needing really like using capital as the buffer to give us more time to reflect, you know what I mean, to then strategize and then decide on what is the next move that we are going to make. And I kind of mentioned this earlier, but I think figuring out the ways where we're moving from, in the ways that it's the small ways, the incremental ways that it's possible for us to move from capitalism again to that socialism. I think that I said before, but I think we are in a space where we already leverage social capital, right? We see that, I would say, most presently now on Instagram, right? There's certain folks among us who they're beyond the algorithm, right? If you have whatever it is, if you have that thing, if you have that you're going to be above and beyond that sort of algorithm. You're still going to be able to get the attention and to garner the level of support that you need is still going to sort of bubble to the top. So I think that one of the ways that we can leverage capital, or one of the ways that I would like to see us leverage capital in a very specific way, would be to create some entrepreneurial spaces, some if you will, like almost our version of essentially like a Shark Tank. For us to bring together ideas and pitch small business grants. And again, I think collectively is doing this with organizations that already exist. But what does that look like for something that doesn't quite exist yet? It's still in that idea phase. But with $1,000, it could be piloted. And then if we see that from there that it has enough of the good bones that we can reinvest, and then continue to see it go from the first to the second to whatever iteration we needed to go to market. I think we also have to begin to shift our attitudes about it. And I think we haven't talked a lot about it a lot in this space, but the attitudes and the judgments around wealth and or the lack thereof. So when we see wealth as just a tool, as opposed to wealth being indicative of somebody's class, like decoupling those things. And I think changing our attitudes about wealth and just seeing it as this person has a lot, this person has land and the ability to grow kale, and this person has the money to purchase the land that we need to actually grow the kale. The kale is actually more important. Those are the actual green bills that we want in our hands. But right now, socially, we're focused more on the dollar. So I think just kind of shifting those attitudes as well.
Yeah, and I just want to support what Bakari is saying, because it goes back to that notion of the collective, like the collective work around addressing that issue. Like I remember as a consultant, one thing that we would try to do, and I wish we had more of the capability to do, was say, okay, how do I get you that contract you need so to make the income that you need so that you can do the work that you really need to do? A lot of times the work that we need to do may not necessarily be the work that necessarily covers our income, but I think that there are ways that we can lean into our capabilities as a community to make sure that folks that are doing this important work are backed, and like that notion of kind of like are kept whole and able to thrive while they also kind of do this work of shifting and reimagining systems. That does require a level of vulnerability though, and a level of safe space that I know some of us have talked about. Like, how do you really create that space where we as individuals and we as a people like feel comfortable to ask for what we need? Because we often come from a context where to ask puts us at risk and puts us in too vulnerable a space, and there are consequences to that. And so I think we have to really think about, like, where does that conversation sit? Like, where do you actually feel comfortable to say, you know what, I'm struggling, or I actually am a little bit worried about, like, what my work is going to look like for the next 12 months, and I need some backing. I'm really kind of thinking about that, because I actually think that we have more of a capability. I think Heber was talking about, we have more of a capability as a community than we often recognize. You know what I mean? We're not fully tapping into it, or in some cases, that capability is working in service of others. So I just, I just think we actually have to think about ways of tapping into that collective. Also, last, I would say that we need to reconsider, like, the notion of need. Sometimes, and that goes back to this notion of, as Bakari was lifting up, of like almost decolonizing this notion of wealth and in income, to really think about, like, what do you really need to feel good and feel whole? And not just survive, but thrive. What does that look like? Like, when you close your eyes, what does that actually look like? Where are you? Who are you interacting with? Like, what you eating? That kind of thing. Like, what are you doing? And if you work backward from that, and for many of us, when you actually start to envision that, it doesn't actually cost but so much. You know what I mean? It's not actually about, like, income in that way. It's about relationship. It's about being in spaces where people, like, really help to enrich you and build you up. It's about, being, what I mean, taking into the beauty of our surroundings and things like that. That's a different way of kind of thinking about wealth. And I think that that's a notion of wealth that is actually more indigenous to us as a people, but sometimes we get away from. So, just back to that notion of, like, we have all of the tools in front of us. It's just a matter of, like, how do we get to the place of, like, tapping into all of them,
If I could offer a thought here too, I wonder, and this is an honest question. I'm just curious to hear what the genius in this room would do with this, because Danielle, as you said, yeah, I have personally seen the amount of land that black people and black churches own around the country. I ain't talking about what I saw on Instagram or Google. I've been on the land. I've seen hundreds of acres. I've seen farmers with houses, like they have guest houses or rooms people could stay. Right now, I'm working with mega churches that want to buy from black farmers. And matter of fact, Bakari, I might need you for a minute. Let's talk later. But in terms of connecting these churches, mega churches, they're ready to spend money. They're tired of going the food bank kind of charitable route. They want to put their money to black farmers and, bring that support in that direction. So for me, sometimes it's like, yo, I ain't talking about pipe dreams. I ain't talking about, one day I'm talking about, I've seen it. we're connecting some dots in some ways. It's making a difference. We are seeing the differences being made. And there's so much more that could be done in this space. So I wonder sometimes, is there room to say, look, we're going to focus. When I was growing up, there's a cartoon called Voltron. And same idea as Captain Planet. With all our powers combined. And then the song was like, Captain Planet. Some of y'all don't know what I'm talking about, but just keep living. So, but I'm like, is there and should there ever be a time where it's like, you know what? If we're trying to build brick by brick in this Booker T. Washington kind of spirit, we're going to get to all the other stuff. Listen, it's clear we need a whole lot. But one thing we know for sure, we need a roof, we need food, we need to be able to defend what we grow and cultivate, as Changa was talking about earlier. You know, the fundamentals, I don't want to call it basic, the fundamentals of life. And I just wonder sometimes the capacity for that kind of prioritizing in the idea of building Black power, because sometimes I think, Davon, that I think sometimes even our notions around building Black power is so seasoned with a Western kind of individualistic, let me, you know, do my own thing and make my name for myself. And then after I do that, then I'll go like, no, wait a minute. You said Ubuntu one too many times. If you talk about there is no me without we is saying we is hungry. Help we eat. And as we eat, we'll have the strength to do all the other things that are very important. But there's a few things that's fundamental. I just wonder what y'all genius does or will do, because I might be tripping it off, and I'm ready to concede the point there. But I'm just really curious about your thoughts on that as well. If we had time, I know time is on us.
Yeah, I just want to jump in and say that I'm a firm believer that the process, the how, is just as important as what we are trying to do, right? And so when you think about it, it's like that notion of starting somewhere. So Heber, if it's like that one farm, or like whatever that thing is, the act of actually coming together to do something, in a way that is radically different from our norm, to me transforms, right? And that is how we build capacity. That's how we actually begin to see and perceive in a different way. And that actually comes from the lens of like someone like as a facilitator. Very often I think about, okay, like what are we trying to accomplish? Yes, but then how do we move through that process in a way that helps us to experience our values and experience, like, and build an experience that transforms the way that we see each other and see see possibilities, And I think that sometimes I think, again, going back to something one of you said about like just kind of working in this kind of Western context, there's such an infatuation with the fast and the big, and like like everything is like tomorrow, let's like build that business tomorrow. And it's like, no, what happened to being deliberate and thoughtful and intentional? And I think Changa was talking about the power of like ritual and getting back to a lot of those practices, which were about pay careful attention to each step along the way, because each step is actually the process of transformation in itself, And I think that just adding that element, yes, start somewhere, but also let's be really intentional about the how in the practice by which we do that work.
So I've talked to all of my friends about this, this like level of cooperative living, specific only because I have actually had an experience doing this. I had an opportunity to do AmeriCorps in post-Katrina New Orleans in a rehab church, and it was an intentional community with, I think there were 7 of us total. So we had community meals and we had to take turns doing all types of chores around the house. We had a little community garden. And I have talked to so many people about actually living cooperatively, and it's like, nah, I don't want to do all that. So I think we also have to, in I think the context specifically of the West, and part of that is also decolonizing, right? What does that look like for us to practice cooperative living? I'm fascinated by it, right? I don't know, it starts to get into that cult realm when you talk about a compound and all of these, these shared spaces, but we've seen it. Like, we know that there are other cultures and communities that practice this. And I feel like we have too much Black genius to not, to some capacity, give that a go, right? So to me, the idea of having a farm in your backyard, and maybe farming is not my particular ministry, but I'm gonna add the pineapple juice and get the roasted sweet potatoes just right. So if that's, you know, if that's what I have to offer into the space, why are we not coming together and sharing all of our skills in that capacity? So I think another level of this conversation when it comes to infrastructure is how much of it is individualized. Like, what's the breaking point? And we all have different thresholds, right? We have so many different, the conditions of the conditioning, right? Some of us, we got PTSD, we have all of these different needs and issues within our community that will require us to have some alone time, to need some isolation, perhaps away from the group. But is there not a way that we can kind of find a space to like marry those two, right? To have a little bit of both of those spaces so that we can just take some of the burden off of one another? Because I think that we could have the most brilliant infrastructure created and then literally just not have enough of us coming into the space because we're exhausted. So as somebody that has practiced cooperative living to a certain extent, you know, it's about how can we work smarter and not harder? So.
Yeah, I mean, as we kind of turn to conclude, and Heber, I think I've actually thought a lot about that question of like, how do we operationalize a collective decision as Black people? You know, because I think a lot of times, like, I think folks have that instinct of, let's figure out what we're doing, but the we is kind of hard to figure out exactly who that we is. And I think, and it's just from my vantage point, I think historically, the way the society is organized, it's easier for Black people to be individuals if you're not committed to our community. You know, like, it's easier to say, I'm gonna just go do this thing over here. I can do some good, and kind of leave it at that. And so one of the things I think is important is this idea of, or one of the things that as I was thinking about this question for a while, I came to this, as I thought about it, like a very simple kind of idea, which is like collective democratic decision-making costs money, you know, and it's an interesting kind of, and time, and so it's one of those things where, you know, to a point that I think Danielle made earlier about just like being able to have a time to even to like build the infrastructure to make those decisions, you know. And I know for me, that's part of the urgency of wanting to convene this conversation, you know, was thinking about like, how do we make this the conversation? Like, how do we make this, like, what do we do as a community to come together and build the infrastructure to be able to prioritize what's important to us, as opposed to leaving it to social media or leaving it to, you know, philanthropy adjacent, you know, activists or organizations, or like, how do we make it so that we do it? And that's a tough, you know, and I think with, you know, Danielle and Bakari, like, I think y'all hit it spot on, like the things that y'all are describing, both in terms of like, do we have to do the decolonization to build the conditions for that kind of collective decision making, and then we gotta have a space and energy to be able to do it. You want to say something, Danielle?
Yeah, you know, I just wanted to tag on to that to say, you know, a lot of times, like when I try to talk about the work of building infrastructure, folks will, you know, kind of say like, well, why does that matter? I don't get it. You know, I don't understand. It doesn't make sense to me, you know, that kind of thing. And, you know, lately I was reading and I stumbled on this concept of infrastructural violence, right? The notion that infrastructure can actually impose violence. It can actually oppress, right, our communities, right? So when you actually think about it from that frame, and actually thinking about this audience, which I think all of us entered into this conversation when you started with like the concept of public safety, right, and the larger this dialogue around like policing, law enforcement, invest, divest, and so all of us in this moment are really thinking about this issue of, you know, in terms of the safety of our communities. But we actually have to think about the fact that as we consider the path forward, how we choose to move forward can either support the well-being of our folks, or it actually can do additional harm. when you asked that question about, you know, that moment where I woke up, you know, it occurred to me after the fact, as I was listening to, you know, all of my co-panelists, that a part of what also made me really wake up was the realization that the institutions I was working for, and in some cases responsible for building, actually did a lot of harm. I mean, tears, right? When folks are under-resourced, have to lay people off, when the initial initiative is canceled suddenly and folks like don't know how they're gonna feed the team that has been doing the work, right? Or the harm that's done when someone has to go through the demoralizing experience of making the case to invest in them, right? Do we ever even have a conversation about what the process of having to ask for investment in our people, right? You're talking about the essence of humanity actually does to our conscience and what does to us as people, right? That's pain, right? So I actually think that, like, if you start to think about this, okay, if we are all concerned right now about, you know, promoting the safety of our communities, we actually have to think about how much we are harmed and, at the hands of the institutions that we build. And I'm talking about that especially within the context of the Black community, when we actually see a lot of institutions that we build, that issue, you know, going back to that issue of, you know, the lack of imagination, like when you actually start building with good intent, but not doing the work of unpacking and re-educating ourselves, and then you end up building the thing that you're actually trying to, you know, work against or fight against, right? And then it actually becomes a tool of your own oppression, right? That's what we're talking about. And I hope that we continue this conversation, because there's so much to unpack there. You're talking about literally different elements of organizing, different types of institutions, different types of infrastructure, but different types of contexts. And again, I believe that the insight is actually with us, right? But we actually need to first start with a conversation that will help us to heal and acknowledge what has happened to us and what we've actually done to each other, right? Because of this larger macro issue, right? So, you know, I really encourage our audience to look into that concept of infrastructural violence and to start reading up on what that really means, because that will tell us a lot about like why this is so critical at this particular time, when, as Bakari said earlier, there is like this seismic shift. There is something shifting, right? But how we step into that opportunity really hinges on like whether we're willing to do the work right now of unpacking some stuff, right? And doing the work of shedding some stuff so that we really can rebuild in a different way. So, you know.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, so what this is telling me, even given some of the questions, we're definitely going to have to do maybe a part 2 and 3, you know, and really take, you know, some of the stuff and go a whole lot deeper. You know, the part, Danielle, that you just said that really resonated, and I think is particularly important on this defund police conversation, is this idea of folks building something that actually ends up becoming a tool of our oppression, right? And if we haven't done the work of kind of decolonizing our own minds and practices and being able to reorient our practices to a liberatory one, then how can we build an institution that won't have the same impact of the ones that, you know, we're saying are oppressive to Black
Absolutely.
people?
Mm-hmm.
You know, so I think that I think is really important, and all the things we talked about this evening, I think, you know, can, as it relates to the concept of defund police, empty into that. But I think in addition to that, or as we go to, you know, think about like what future conversations will be, which I think will help us think about like how to, you know, so what does it take to build alternative institutions that are not mired in the kind of toxicity of Western culture? You know, I think in terms of the immediate conversations, what I really appreciate about the conversation that we've had this evening is that it demonstrates all that needs to be talked about and discussed and unpacked as we think about what to allocate resources to, right? And even the conversation of like the how, like how do we, you know, reallocate resources? You know, I mean, I saw a couple of questions, and again, we couldn't get to them, conversations about like healing, because I think there's a lot about healing that's going to be important in terms of how we build stuff, you know, amongst our community. And that could be that's really could be its own thing. We actually, LBS had the pleasure of doing a couple of trainings with the Warrior Healer Builder Collective folks out of Atlanta that really talked about, they talk about the importance of Black people being builders, healers, and warriors, and needing to be, all three. And so, so there's a whole lot to get to, but so what I want to do, just again in conclusion, is to say that, again, the purpose of this conversation is to really just shed light on the importance of all the things that need to be considered. And so that while the policy work is important in terms of addressing the harm of, law enforcement and the police state and the idea of defunding police, this conversation is just as important, if not more important, in terms of what are we building to take its place, and what are we building so that we can sustain ourselves beyond this particular moment. So I want to, first thank y'all for doing this call. I mean, it was good because we all know each other, you know what I'm saying? And, I think we've all talked about different aspects of the stuff with each other. So it was good to just talk. I like to ask, the panelists that are left to maybe give just a couple of minutes of just kind of closing remarks, and maybe even just some general ideas about what a part 2 or 3 would look like to this conversation. Who wants to go first?
I think we're all waiting for each other. I love listening to everybody on the panel, so I was just over here taking notes. So I was like, "Who's gonna go first?"
I know my sheet is all. My sheet is. I scratched
cannot
all
wait
over the
till
place.
part 2. Yes,
Yes, I'm definitely.
So that's admittedly what I was just like. Wait a minute, I just want to hear it. But I'll start by saying I just want to lift up. I want to, as my closing comment, I would actually want to lift up one of my best friends, but my partner in this work, Samantha Mellerson, and I lift her up because. When we we're kind of more in this consulting space, but in all of the work that we've done, we've often done it in partnership. And there's a reason for that. So when we often work with folks to build something new, often brought in to, when something goes wrong and something needs to be rebuilt, that kind of thing, there's a balance to this work. So where, I've often held the lens around, what are we trying to build? How do we build it? She holds the lens around, how do you actually support people as the anchors of that work to rebuild in the process that they have to go through in order to transform ourselves at the organizational level. And I lift that up because one part of this, and I think someone in the questions kind of asked a question about healing, right? I actually see the person work, and I think Sam would also say that the person work is so essential to this work of building infrastructure. And we work in a context where when you're talking about infrastructure, I started by talking about how it's often defined in a very technical sense and in a way that removes us as people away from this notion of infrastructure. But if we're honest about how communities organize and flow and how resources and everything are brokered, people are actually the most powerful institution there ever will be, right? And so if you think about that, each of us can actually start this work now of actually spending time with ourselves to say, who am I in my most powerful form, right? What does that look like? What am I doing? Who am I interacting with? What do I need, right? And then start working backward from that to say, what kind of spaces support me in that, right? That will actually give us a really a lot of indication of where we need to go in this dialogue. Because if we're honest again, a lot of the spaces that we navigate through in our day-to-day don't feel good to us, especially as Black people. They don't recognize fully who we are. They reduce us to kind of feeling like a fraction of what we should feel, you know what I mean? And so there's something there that we need to actually unpack and talk a little bit more about. So I just want to lift up the power of people in the
Uh-oh, you froze up a little bit, Danielle. All right. I guess I'll text her and tell her no, it froze.
I'm gonna hop in.
You want to jump in?
Yeah, I'll hop in. I'm also excited about the possibility of having a part 2. Being in Baltimore, and just in different parts of the country, there are so many different programs, whether it's AmeriCorps, AmeriCorps Vista, Baltimore Corps. There are so many of these pilots and programs that I've participated in or, you know, become knowledgeable about that create a salary, in a lot of cases it's a stipend, but invest funds in individuals that are committed to doing very specific work, usually for a term. And I think that there are a lot of pieces that are terribly wrong about those models. I think AmeriCorps, you know, and the city year, I think kind of forcing folks to live at the poverty level, I think by default that only serves to limit your imagination. But I think there are some really good aspects of those models that already exist that I think we could start to pull from and say, this is what we want to build. This is a 3-year pilot. And this is how we envision this small group of individuals functioning. We see them as, you know, whether it's thought leaders, doers, movers, builders, sustainers, et cetera. I think that we have access to the resources that we could pull together. And when I say we have resources, I mean, I think we have enough data scientists. I think we have enough therapists that we could, you know, create and support the mental health around some of these aspects. I think we have enough scientists, enough, you know, access to help us get access to the full range of health benefits that would be, you know, required, housing, all of the resources that we would need to essentially outfit a position, a paid position for some of our people to come in and do some of this work, and start to connect the dots. I feel like the ongoing conversation in Baltimore is the keyword silo, right? We all know, we've heard it, blah, blah, blah. So I think starting to put that money up, and what would that look like, right? If we decide it's, you know, 200 or 250,000 to fund 1 year or whatever those specific dollar amounts are, I think we start to operationalize those things and figure out what that looks like to fund some of those positions. Because it's going to be, I would say it's going to be very broad work at the onset. And so using some of that capital that we have access to say, this is something that's radical. It's going to be experimental to a certain extent, but we see it as something that's worth, and there's a difference between an experiment and making some really educated decisions, right? From all of the experiences that we have learned from collectively, right? We have enough research studies out there to kind of be able to say and back, I think, some of that structure that we could put together ourselves. So that's one of the things that I want to kind of just offer into the space. And then I would say, as we wrap up and close out, I think just really, I support everything that Danielle said from an individual level and figuring out where we can redirect that energy, because I think a lot of times we get into these spaces when I just speaking for myself, I feel the vibration just lifted in this space. Not to be on my super kumbaya, but it's a rainbow outside my window right now from the rain and all of that good stuff, which I'm gonna go ahead and embrace it as a symbol. But how do we leverage some of that energy? So if that means that you text somebody tonight, say, yo, go watch the replay, so that when part 2 comes on and maybe we break out into Zoom groups, maybe that's part 3, I don't know. But that we kind of come together and don't let this energy just like sit still and be stagnant, that we really kind of do what we can to recycle it and repurpose it forward.
You want to finish where you left off, Danielle?
Oh man, I probably said enough. I was on a roll, but I just you was
going off though, Danielle. It was good.
But I just wanted to reinforce the notion of like the importance of like that personal work, you know, as a part of this work, because often it's just not acknowledged as a part of it. And I also just wanted to say that I just really appreciate this space. I just wanted to thank you again, Davon, for bringing us together, because especially at this time, like folks are just working so hard. It has, and given all of the physical distancing and everything like that, it's actually been tough to find spaces just to come together and talk. And I mean, like, come together to speak outside of role, you know what I mean? Because I often find, you know, personally, like working in philanthropy in these types of fields, that because of where I work and what position I'm in, it is very hard to open an honest conversation about, all right, like, what are we seeing though? And what do we need to share with each other about what these spaces are, what they're not, like what solutions there are and what they're not, so that we actually hear each other. And I think that a part of that solution requires like really intentional facilitation and folks that have the ability to connect across all of these different worlds. So I just want to thank you for that as we close. I really appreciate that.
All right, you got the benediction for us, Heber?
Yeah, I thought I thought Danielle logged off because she knew I was going to ask her for $1, but I'll say, nah, I'm joking. Let me say, this has been amazing, and I concur. I appreciate the conversation, the invitation, and I think sure there's part 2, part 3 that could happen, and I also think there's some parts of this that should be in the analog, offline in smaller circles, and so yeah, just thank you. I'll just add that what LBS has been very good about, and so many other groups as well, is collectively, the list can go on, is about reminding us that we can move from a scarcity and deficiency mentality when it comes to how we address the things that we're going through. Davon, in particular, you've been very good with that over the years, reminding us and instructing us with respect to the fact that we have enough to do what we're called to do. We have enough to do what we're called to do. But if you line up at the same starting line of, tell me how bad it was in your neighborhood, give me all the terrible statistics of your community, and then fall into that trap of saying, yeah, one time the people at school said I couldn't read good, and then my mama and then my daddy did this, and you know, and so I think that I'm just sitting with that in this moment, especially as I bear witness to the genius of the people on this in this conversation. We have enough. We good. And when I think about my upbringing, that might be very similar to some, in the fact that, like, there are very real elements of poverty, and I didn't know we was poor till somebody told us we was poor. And that was just part of my experience. Like, I watched my big mama go into an empty refrigerator and pull out a feast. I watched growing up eating syrup sandwiches. We ain't need no meat. Like, get that syrup. You remember syrup sandwiches, Davon?
Do I?
Cheerios with tap water. Come on, man. And so I'm like, when I think about how resourceful, how innovative, how genius, how creative, out of necessity that our people have had to be, this moment might be calling for more of that creative genius even now. And especially if there's a second wave of this virus and disease, when the charity money runs out, when the farms slow down, and when it's winter in the middle of a quarantine situation, I'm just trying to help us to remember that you ain't just arrived here. Like, you got some stuff inside of you, and we have some stuff inside of us that can navigate this space. And so I'm grateful just for the conversation and all of the ways. And I'll just say, finally, you started us with the book, Davon, and some people in the chat were asking, what should I read? And I just want to co-sign what you said at the top about this book. Jessica Gordon Nimhard. One of the things I love about the text is how detailed she offers, very detailed summaries of probably hundreds of configurations of Black folk who organized around food, around finance, around health, around you name it. It's in the book, and it can serve as fertilizer to our imagination to help us to dream a little bit bigger and get that inspiration to say, oh, wow, we have done this before. Or some group did attempt something similar to my wildest dream. And if they got that close, how can I build on top of that? So I just want to point back to the text as well and ask people, sit with the ancestors. Name your ancestors. Pour libation, call their names, get quiet, start the day in quiet. And as much as sometimes I'm at fault for this, when you wake up, don't rush to the screen first. Find a porch, find a garden, find a window or a rainbow, and give the ancestors a chance to get a word in before the world gets loud. I'll end with that.
Hey, no better way to end than that. Again, thank y'all for tuning in. I want to thank the family out here for watching this. Just want to reiterate, LBS, Black Grassroots Organization, Black, independent. We encourage you all, if you like, conversations like this and want to support our work, please become a sustainer. you know, that helps us to remain independent so we can have conversations like this. It's the ability to be Black and independent that allows us to be able to be part of such a great community and network of Black people that are doing amazing stuff in Baltimore and beyond. So again, this is Davon Love, Director of Public Policy, Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. I want to thank you all for watching. Enjoy the rest of the evening. Peace.